I sometimes close my eyes, and I'm there again. The summer of 1972, a restless golden season humming with gasoline and promise. The sun would hang heavy over the two-lane highways, shimmering on the hoods of cars that looked more like sculptures than machines. Chrome gleamed like polished mirrors. Vinyl roofs soaked up the heat, and everywhere you turned there was the deep, low growl of a V8 engine warming the air. Hello and welcome. You're watching Retro Days with David, a place where I share my passion for the past and celebrate the timeless stories, sounds, and spirit that shaped this country. From the golden age of classic cars to the unforgettable music and cultural milestones that define generations, this channel is dedicated to honoring those memories. If you're visiting for the first time, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of my upcoming journeys into America's rich and fascinating history. The early 1970s were a remarkable moment. We were stepping out of a turbulent decade and into a new chapter. The music softened a little. Fashion turned bolder, and cars, well, cars were everything. They were how we defined ourselves, how we rebelled, how we fell in love and found our place in the world. They weren't just transportation. They were companions, reflections of our personalities, and extensions of our dreams. I remember Saturday nights when Main Street would transform into a river of motion and light. Every car seemed to have its own story. A gleaming Chevrolet Chevelle SS would thunder past the diner, its 454 big block rumbling like distant thunder. Across the street, a Ford Torino Cobra sat idling beneath a street lamp, its matte black hood stripe cutting across metallic red paint like a scar. Teenagers leaned on the hoods of their cars, sipping root beer floats and trading stories about the latest modifications, while the jukebox inside blasted Three Dog Night and the Rolling Stones. That was the magic of the era. Cars were more than machines. They were part of the soundtrack. One of the first cars that captured my heart was the Oldsmobile 442. I'll never forget the first time I saw one, in the summer of '71. It was parked in front of the record shop where I worked part-time, a gold coupe with black racing stripes and the kind of stance that made it look like it was ready to leap forward at any moment. The owner, a local mechanic named Steve, tossed me the keys one day and said, "Go ahead, kid. Take her around the block." The roar when I turned the key was something primal, a deep, living sound that you felt more than heard. The Hurst shifter was firm and precise under my palm, and when I pressed the accelerator, the 455 V8 answered instantly, surging forward with authority. By the time I looped back to the shop, I knew this wasn't just a car. It was an experience, a conversation between man and machine that you never wanted to end. The Buick GSX was another beast of the boulevard. Built for the driver who wanted both luxury and brute strength, it combined comfort with staggering performance. I knew a guy named Ray who had a yellow '70 GSX with the black Stage 1 hood stripe, a car so loud it could rattle windows 2 blocks away. Ray treated that Buick like a living thing. He waxed it every Sunday, tuned it religiously, and drove it with a mix of reverence and aggression. When he hit the throttle, that Stage 1 engine, nearly 510 pound-feet of torque, would throw you back in your seat and keep you there until you begged for mercy. But not all the great cars of the '70s were about raw power. Some were about personality, style, and the sheer joy of being different. The AMC Javelin, for instance, was the underdog's answer to the Big Three's muscle machines. Its swooping lines and bold colors, bright oranges, deep blues, screaming reds, gave it a look that was pure late 60s optimism carried into a new decade. It was a car for those who didn't want to blend in. I had a college friend named Mark who drove a Javelin AMX. We'd cruise down Pacific Coast Highway in that thing, windows down, Fleetwood Mac on the stereo, the salt air mixing with the scent of high-octane fuel. People would wave, kids would point, and every time we stopped for gas, someone would ask, "What is that?" That was the charm of the Javelin. It wasn't about being the fastest or the most expensive. It was about turning heads and sparking conversations. The Ford Torino was another unforgettable figure of the decade. Sleek, muscular, and packed with attitude, it straddled the line between family car and street legend. The Torino Cobra in particular, with its 429 Cobra jet engine, was a monster. I remember seeing one drag race a Camaro Z28 at a stoplight showdown. The Torino roared off the line with such force that it left the Chevy staring at its taillights all the way down the block. It wasn't just a car. It was a statement. Ford still knew how to build something that made your pulse race. And then there was the Pontiac GTO Judge, still prowling the streets in the early 70s, its legacy secure, even as emissions regulations tightened and insurance premiums rose. The Judge stood defiant. The bold graphics, the rear spoiler, the Ram Air 3 engine, it was a muscle car that refused to apologize for existing. My cousin owned one in Orbit Orange, and every time he pulled up to family gatherings, conversation stopped. It was loud, brash, and beautiful. Exactly what a muscle car was meant to be. But it wasn't just the cars themselves that made the 70s unforgettable. It was the world they lived in. There was a certain romance to the rituals of the road. Gas stations were more than places to fill up. They were social hubs. You'd pull in. The attendant would wave and wipe your windshield, check your oil, maybe even strike up a conversation about last night's baseball game. You'd sip a cold Coke under the neon glow of a Sinclair or a Gulf sign while your engine cooled. Road trips were adventures. Without GPS, we relied on folded paper maps, the occasional hand-drawn directions, and a healthy dose of intuition. Families would pile into station wagons like the Chevrolet Caprice Estate or Ford Country Squire, wood paneling gleaming in the sun, luggage strapped to the roof, kids fighting over who got the window seat. The back seats smelled faintly of vinyl in summer, a mix of sunscreen, fast food wrappers, and the occasional spilled root beer. And when the car finally merged onto the open highway, it felt like the whole world lay ahead. It's funny to think about now, but back then, cars even sounded different. Engines spoke in full sentences. A cold start on a crisp morning would deliver a symphony of clicks, burbles, and growls before settling into a low, confident idle. Revving a big block V8 was like summoning thunder, a deep, rolling sound that echoed down the street and announced your arrival before you were even in sight. Modern engines are whisper, quiet, and efficient, but they lack that personality, that conversation between you and the machine. Even the interiors were a world of their own. Dashboards wrapped around you like cockpits. Gauges glowed softly in the night, and steering wheels were broad and purposeful. Bucket seats hugged you in a way that felt personal, and there was always something magical about the feel of a classic Hurst shifter or the satisfying click of a mechanical radio tuner. The smell inside a '70s car, a mix of leather, fuel, and sunlight-warmed plastic, is one of those scents that can transport you instantly back in time. Those interiors, now that I think of them, were part of the magic, and they were deeply personal. I remember how the dash of my buddy Jack's 1973 Dodge Charger SE had a faint crack across the top from too many summers under the sun, but we never thought of it as a flaw. It was character, a mark of life lived. The faux wood grain panels, the push-button AM radio that sometimes needed a thump to come alive, and the way the heat would pour out of the vents on a cold January morning, it all formed part of the personality. Cars back then were like people, imperfect, unpredictable, but always memorable. And the little details mattered more than anyone realizes today. The sound of keys jingling as you walked toward the driveway, the way the heavy steel doors would thunk shut with a satisfying finality, the smell of gasoline on your hands after filling up, even the way the hood felt warm beneath your fingertips after a long drive. These were sensory signatures, little fragments of daily life that stitched themselves into the tapestry of memory. You didn't just own a car. You lived with it, shared moments with it, and let it mark the milestones of your life. Take the Plymouth Cuda, for example. By the early '70s, it had become one of the most recognizable names in American performance. Aggressive lines, bold colors, shaker hoods, and engines that could humble anything on the street. The Cuda was built for those who wanted to make an entrance. I remember a kid named Tommy who showed up to senior prom in a plum-crazy '71 Cuda. It was loud, it was unapologetic, and when he pulled up to the school gymnasium, every head turned. That car wasn't just transportation, it was an announcement. I'm here and I'm alive. Then there was the Dodge Challenger RT, a car that still gives me goosebumps when I see one today. Its wide stance and split grille looked like a predator ready to pounce. The 426 Hemi under the hood could deliver more power than most of us could handle, and we loved it for that. Driving a Challenger wasn't easy. It demanded respect, skill, and a little bit of courage. But once you mastered it, the reward was unlike anything else. I once drove a friend's Challenger down a deserted stretch of Route 66 at sunset. The engine's roar mixed with the sound of the wind and the fading notes of a Led Zeppelin track on the radio. It felt like flying, like being weightless, like the world had shrunk to nothing but asphalt and adrenaline. As the decade progressed, things began to change. The oil crisis of 1973 hit like a thunderclap, and suddenly gas wasn't cheap anymore. People worried about fuel economy, emissions regulations grew tighter, and some said the glory days of the muscle car were over. But here's the thing. Even as the industry adapted, even as cars became a little quieter and a little less thirsty, the spirit of the era didn't die. It just evolved. One of the best examples of that evolution was the Pontiac Firebird formula. It didn't scream for attention like the Trans Am, but it offered balanced performance, handling, and everyday usability that made it a joy to drive. Pontiac understood that passion didn't have to disappear. It just had to mature. And then there was the Chevrolet Monte Carlo, a personal luxury coupe that blurred the line between performance and comfort. Long hoods, sweeping lines, and plush interiors made it the choice of those who wanted style as much as speed. I drove one once on a road trip to the Smoky Mountains, and I still remember the way it seemed to float over the road, devouring miles with effortless grace. Even the Mercury Cougar XR7 deserves a special place in the story. It wasn't the loudest or the fastest, but it exuded a quiet confidence. It was a gentleman's muscle car, powerful enough to thrill but refined enough to impress a date at a fancy restaurant. I took my future wife out in one on our second date. We drove to a drive-in movie, parked under the stars, and listened to the film through a tinny speaker hooked to the window. That night, she told me she could see herself spending the rest of her life with me. To this day, whenever I see a cougar, I remember that moment. The smell of buttered popcorn, the glow of the projector, the sound of the V8 idling softly as we talked about the future, and oh, the drive-in theaters. They were as much a part of car culture as the cars themselves. You'd roll in with a trunk full of snacks, park next to friends, and spend the evening watching movies under the open sky. Couples shared milkshakes, kids played tag between rows of parked cars, and engines occasionally purred to life as someone ducked out for another box of popcorn. The glow from the screen reflected off polished chrome, and the night air carried a mix of exhaust, popcorn, and laughter. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a ritual. Gas stations, too, had a soul back then. They weren't anonymous rows of self-service pumps like today. They were full-service stops where attendants knew your name, where they'd check your oil, wash your windshield, and sometimes even give your tires a quick inspection, all while chatting about the weather or the local ball game. I remember pulling into a Texaco station in my '74 Firebird on a rainy night. The attendant, a retired mechanic named Bill, stepped out into the drizzle without hesitation, wiped my windshield, topped off my fluids, and waved me on with a grin. That kind of small-town kindness seems rarer now, but it was woven into the fabric of the road back then. And then there were the roadside diners, the heartbeat of the American highway. You'd pull off the interstate after hours behind the wheel and slide into a red vinyl booth with a chrome-edged table. The waitress would pour you a steaming cup of coffee without even asking and call you hon before setting down a plate of bacon and eggs. The jukebox would hum with Fleetwood Mac or the Eagles. Neon lights would flicker against the glass, and outside, the cars in the parking lot would glisten under the glow of sodium lamps. You'd sip your coffee, watch the rain slide down the windows, and know that everything, absolutely everything, was right in the world. What made that era so unforgettable wasn't just the cars themselves, but the culture they created. Friday night, cruise-ins at the local burger joint. Saturday morning car washes in the driveway with a bucket, sponge, and garden hose. Sunday afternoon drives just for the sake of driving, no destination, no deadline, just the road and the horizon. It was a slower world, a more deliberate one, where people took pride in the journey, not just the destination. Today's cars are marvels of technology, safer, smarter, more efficient. They talk to satellites, park themselves, and sip fuel like it's liquid gold. And I'm grateful for that progress. But they're also quieter, more clinical, and in many ways, more distant. They don't rattle your bones with the roar of a carbureted V8. They don't demand that you feel every shift through a 4-speed manual. They don't make you reach out and tune the radio by hand, searching for that perfect song as you crest a hill with the sunset ahead. The cars of the 1970s made you part of the experience. You weren't just a passenger. You were a participant. You listened, you touched, you smelled, you worked, and you felt. And that, more than anything, is what makes those memories so precious now. I think about how much my life happened behind the wheel. First kisses and last goodbyes. Road trips with friends who've long since scattered to the winds. Late-night conversations parked under the stars, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Countless sunrises and sunsets seen through bug-spattered windshields. Each of those moments is etched into the chrome and steel of the cars that carried me there. And even now, decades later, I can't help but smile when I see a restored Cuda or a mint-condition Torino at a car show. People gather around them with the same wide-eyed wonder we once did. Teenagers snap photos, older folks trade stories, and for a few minutes, the years fall away. The cars haven't changed. They're still here, still roaring, still turning heads, and in their presence, neither have we. I remember the last summer before everything started to change. 1979. There was something bittersweet in the air that year, like the end of a long song you didn't want to stop. The streets were still alive with chrome and horsepower, but you could feel the winds shifting. Smaller engines, stricter emissions, a new focus on practicality. The raw, untamed muscle of the late 60s and early 70s was giving way to a more measured, sensible era. But even then, there were flashes of the old magic, cars that refused to go quietly into the night. One of them was the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Special Edition, the same black and gold beauty that Burt Reynolds made iconic in Smokey and the Bandit. By the end of the decade, it had become more than just a car. It was a cultural symbol, a piece of Americana as instantly recognizable as a pair of Levi's or a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. Its flared fenders, screaming bird hood, decal, and T-top roof spoke to something primal in us, a love of freedom, rebellion, and the open road. I remember watching one pull out of a gas station at dusk, tail lights glowing like embers, and thinking, this is what America looks like. The Chevrolet Corvette L82 was another standout. By 1978, it wasn't just about raw speed anymore. It was about balance, handling, and sophistication. But the Stingray's curves were as seductive as ever, and its performance still turned highways into playgrounds. I once borrowed a friend's silver '79 Corvette for a weekend trip to the coast. I can still feel the way the steering tightened through mountain switchbacks, the way the wind whipped through the T-top roof, and the way strangers at gas stations stopped to ask questions, just to be near it. That's the thing about cars like that. They don't just take you places. They draw people in. They make the world feel smaller, friendlier, more connected. And who could forget the Chrysler Cordoba, with its rich Corinthian leather and effortless grace? It wasn't a muscle car, but it didn't need to be. It represented another side of the decade, one where comfort, luxury, and presence mattered just as much as horsepower. I remember riding in one to a wedding in '78, the interior cool and plush, the cabin filled with soft Motown playing the radio. The road hummed beneath us, and it felt less like driving and more like gliding, a sensation that modern luxury cars try hard to recreate, but never quite match. Even cars like the AMC Pacer and Gremlin, quirky and often mocked in their day, are part of the story. They spoke to a different dream, one of practicality, individuality, and experimentation. They were proof that the 1970s weren't just about brute force. They were about creativity and daring, about pushing the boundaries of what a car could be. And though they were often the punchlines of jokes, there's something endearing about them now. They were cars with personality, imperfect perhaps, but never boring. The decade's close brought with it something else, too. The dawn of a new kind of car culture. Street racing gave way to organized car shows. Drive-ins slowly faded, replaced by multiplexes and malls. Cruise nights became less about impressing strangers and more about celebrating shared passions. And yet, even as the world evolved, the bond between man and machine remained as strong as ever. The cars of the 1970s didn't just survive the changes, they shaped the road ahead. I often think about what those cars meant to us beyond the obvious. They were, in a way, mirrors, reflecting our values, our ambitions, our personalities. The Camaro Z28 was for the young and fearless. The Cadillac Eldorado was for those who had made it and wanted the world to know. The Javelin was for the rebels who refused to follow the crowd. The Cuda was for the dreamers who wanted to go fast and never look back. And the Firebird Trans Am, that was for everyone, and because deep down we all wanted to feel like outlaws once in a while. They also marked the chapters of our lives. I bought my first car, a used '71 Mustang Mach 1, with money I'd saved from working nights at a gas station. I proposed to my wife in the front seat of a Monte Carlo, parked by the lake with the radio playing Just the Way You Are. I drove my newborn son home from the hospital in a well-worn Oldsmobile 98, its back seat piled with blankets and diapers. And decades later, I taught that same son how to drive in a 1975 Buick Regal we'd restored together in the garage. The paint wasn't perfect, and the engine coughed a little on cold mornings, but it was ours, and that mattered more than anything. The truth is, those cars were more than machines. They were companions on the road of life. They were witnesses to our triumphs and our heartbreaks. They were part of our stories, sometimes in the background, sometimes center stage, but always there. They taught us patience when they wouldn't start on cold mornings, responsibility when they needed maintenance we couldn't afford, and joy when they roared to life and carried us somewhere we'd never been before. And long after they've left our driveways, they remain parked somewhere in the heart, gleaming, rumbling reminders of who we were and how far we've come. I look around today and see how far the automotive world has traveled. Electric motors hum where V8s once roared. Dashboards glow with digital displays instead of analog gauges. Cars connect to satellites, guide us to destinations, and even stop themselves in emergencies. It's extraordinary, a testament to human ingenuity. And yet, for all that progress, there's a part of me that still longs for the simplicity and soul of those older machines. There's something irreplaceable about turning a key and feeling an engine come alive beneath your feet, about shifting gears manually and feeling every vibration through the steering wheel, about knowing that if you want to go faster, it's all up to you. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons, I'll visit a classic car show and just walk among the rows of gleaming metal and polished chrome. I'll run my hand along the fender of a '72 GTO, peer inside a mint-condition Challenger, or listen to the burble of a rebuilt Chevelle idle in the summer heat. And in those moments, I'm not an old man in his 60s. I'm 20 again, standing under a streetlight with a milkshake in one hand and a set of car keys in the other. The night stretching endlessly ahead, and the whole world waiting beyond the next stoplight. Maybe that's why the cars of the 1970s still matter so much. They're more than relics. They're time machines. They take us back to a world that moved a little slower, felt a little freer, and believed a little more in the power of dreams. They remind us of who we were, wide-eyed, reckless, full of hope, and of the roads we traveled to become who we are. And every now and then, when I'm driving down a modern highway in my quiet, efficient sedan, I'll catch sight of a restored Trans Am in the lane beside me. I'll hear the faint rumble of its engine, see the sunlight bounce off its hood decal, and feel a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, because in that moment I know that the spirit of the 1970s, that wild, roaring, unstoppable spirit, is still alive. It's out there on the road, chasing the horizon, refusing to grow old, and perhaps, in a way, so am I. Thank you for spending this time with me and taking a step back into the world of retro America. If you enjoyed revisiting the moments, eras, and stories that helped shape our lives, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and turning on notifications. There's so much more to explore together. And I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Which decade holds the fondest memories for you? The classic 50s, the transformative 60s, or the bold and changing 70s? Your stories and reflections mean a lot.